Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. 5 elite women spent the entire night trying to win the billionaire's attention, but the woman he couldn't stop looking at wasn't even supposed to be there. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Monarch Ballroom cast a warm golden glow across the polished marble floors, turning every corner of the luxury hotel into something that looked pulled from the pages of a magazine. Soft piano music drifted through the air, while servers in black suits carried silver trays filled with sparkling drinks and carefully arranged appetizers. The room buzzed with quiet conversations, expensive laughter, and the subtle confidence of people who never worried about paying bills. Everyone seemed to belong here. Everyone except Elena Hartwell. She stood behind the registration table near the entrance, trying not to fidget with the sleeves of her navy blue dress. The dress was simple, elegant enough for the evening, but it wasn't hers. It belonged to her cousin Rachel, who had called in sick that afternoon and begged Elena to cover her shift. Elena had agreed because saying no felt impossible, and because Rachel desperately needed the money from the event management company. Now, standing beneath lights brighter than anything she was used to, Elena was beginning to regret it. She glanced at her reflection in a nearby glass panel. Her blonde hair was pinned neatly behind her ears. Her makeup was minimal. Her hands, however, refused to stop trembling. Just smile and hand out name badges, she whispered to herself. You can survive 4 hours. A line of guests continued moving toward her station. CEOs, investors, socialites, and celebrities she recognized from magazine covers all passed by one after another. Most barely looked at her. Some offered polite smiles. Others seemed to look straight through her. Elena didn't take it personally. She knew she wasn't part of their world. She was a freelance illustrator who spent most days working from a small apartment in Brooklyn, surrounded by sketchbooks, coffee mugs, and unfinished drawings. Luxury galas weren't exactly her natural habitat. She reached for another guest badge when the stack suddenly slipped from her hands. Hundreds of laminated cards scattered across the marble floor. Oh no, her stomach dropped. The nearest guest stepped around the mess without slowing down. Elena immediately crouched down, cheeks burning with embarrassment. Perfect, she muttered. 30 minutes in, and I'm already making headlines. She scrambled to collect the badges before anyone important noticed. Then she saw another pair of hands reaching for the cards. Large hands. Steady hands. Expensive watch. Elena looked up. The man kneeling beside her wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. Dark brown hair. Calm blue eyes. The kind of face that looked familiar even when you knew you had never met him before. Looks like these things are determined to escape, he said with an easy smile. His voice carried none of the impatience she expected. Elena laughed nervously. Apparently they know I'm not qualified for this job. You seem qualified enough. That makes one of us. The man chuckled softly and handed her a stack of recovered badges. For a moment, neither of them moved. Around them, guests continued flowing into the ballroom. Conversations blended together into a distant hum. Yet somehow the noise felt far away. Thank you, Elena said as she accepted the cards. You didn't have to help. I know. Then why did you? He considered the question for a second. Because everyone else walked past. Something about the answer caught her off guard. Most people would have joked. Most would have brushed it off. But he said it like he meant it. Elena smiled. Fair enough. The man stood and offered his hand to help her up. She accepted. The moment she rose to her feet, she realized she still had no idea who he was. Judging by the tuxedo, he was obviously wealthy. Judging by his confidence, probably successful. But unlike many of the guests entering the ballroom, he didn't seem interested in advertising it. Are you here for the gala? She asked. I suppose you could say that. That sounds mysterious. Maybe I like mysterious. Elena rolled her eyes playfully. That's exactly what a mysterious person would say. For the first time, his smile widened into something genuine. Before he could respond, someone called his name from across the room. The man glanced toward the ballroom entrance, then back at Elena. Looks like I'm needed. Well, thanks again for the rescue. Anytime. He hesitated briefly before walking away. Elena watched him disappear into the growing crowd. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why their brief conversation felt different from all the others she'd had that evening. What she didn't know was that the man she had just joked with was Graham Whitmore, one of the youngest billionaires in America. And while 5 of the most powerful women in the room had spent weeks planning how to get his attention tonight, Graham Whitmore had already noticed the one woman who never tried. Elena returned to the registration table and tried to focus on her work, but her eyes kept drifting toward the ballroom. She was not usually the kind of person who noticed strangers. In fact, she spent most of her life avoiding attention whenever possible. Yet something about the man who had helped her felt different. Maybe it was the way he had stopped when nobody else did. Maybe it was the fact that he had spoken to her like an equal. Whatever the reason, she found herself wondering who he was. The ballroom had become even more crowded now. Crystal glasses reflected the chandelier light, while conversations floated through the room like music. Elena checked in another guest, handed over a name badge, and offered a polite smile. Then she glanced up again. The mysterious man stood near the center of the room. Except now he was no longer alone. A group of elegant women surrounded him. Each looked as though she belonged on the cover of a luxury magazine. One wore a designer gown covered in shimmering silver details. Another carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent her entire life attending events like this. A third laughed loudly at something he said, placing a hand lightly against his arm. Elena quickly looked away. She suddenly felt silly for thinking about him at all. Of course a man like that would be surrounded by beautiful women. Of course he belonged with people who understood his world. She turned her attention back to her work. A few minutes later, Rachel's supervisor approached. "Everything going okay?" he asked. "So far," Elena replied. "Good. The guest list is complete. Once everyone is checked in, you can relax a little." "Really? You are officially off duty in 20 minutes. Elena smiled with relief. 20 minutes later, she finally stepped away from the registration desk. She wandered toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, where a large window overlooked the Manhattan skyline. The city lights stretched endlessly into the darkness. Cars moved below like streams of glowing ribbons. Elena loved moments like this, places where she could observe without being observed. She slipped a small sketchbook from her purse. It was worn at the edges and covered with pencil marks from years of use. Inside the front cover sat a handmade bookmark decorated with tiny watercolor wildflowers. Whenever she felt nervous, she sketched. It helped organize her thoughts. She began drawing the outline of the city skyline. The simple movement of pencil against paper immediately calmed her racing mind. Most people come here to network. Elena nearly jumped. She turned and found the same man standing beside her. "And most people do not sneak up on strangers," she replied. His smile appeared instantly. "Fair point. Should you not be over there?" Elena nodded toward the crowd gathered around him. "You seem popular." He followed her gaze and laughed softly. "Popular is one way to describe it. What is the other way?" "Trapped." She laughed despite herself. "That bad?" "You have no idea." For a moment, they stood together looking out over the city. The noise of the gala faded behind them. "So," he said, glancing toward her sketchbook, "what are you drawing?" Elena hesitated before showing him the page. "Nothing special." "It looks special." She lowered her eyes. Compliments always made her uncomfortable. "It is just a hobby." "You say that like it is something to apologize for." People usually expect hobbies to become careers. Maybe people expect too much. Elena studied him for a moment. There was something unusual about the way he listened. Most people waited for their turn to speak. He seemed genuinely interested in every answer she gave. "You know," she said, "I still do not know your name." Before he could answer, a sharply dressed woman approached them. "There you are," she said with a dazzling smile directed entirely at him. "Everyone has been looking for you." The man sighed almost imperceptibly. Elena noticed it immediately. The woman barely seemed to. "I should probably rescue them from themselves," he said. "Or rescue yourself from them," Elena suggested. His eyes brightened. "Maybe that too." As he turned to leave, his gaze fell on the small bookmark tucked inside her sketchbook. For a second, he seemed fascinated by it. Then the woman gently guided him back toward the crowd. Elena watched them disappear into the ballroom once again, completely unaware that while 5 accomplished women competed for Graham Whitmore's attention, the only person occupying his thoughts was the quiet artist standing alone by the window. The woman who had interrupted their conversation kept Graham occupied for nearly 20 minutes. During that time, Elena tried convincing herself that she should stop paying attention to him altogether. It was ridiculous. She did not belong in this room. He clearly did. Whatever brief connection they had shared was simply the result of two strangers crossing paths for a few moments. Yet every time she looked toward the crowd, she somehow found him again. The gala continued unfolding around them. Business leaders exchanged handshakes. Photographers captured carefully planned smiles. Waiters moved between tables carrying elegant desserts. Through it all, Graham seemed to play a role everyone expected him to play. He smiled. He listened. He nodded. But from where Elena stood, none of it looked natural. It looked exhausting. She had just finished another sketch of the skyline when she heard a familiar voice. "You are still hiding over here." Elena looked up. Graham stood beside her once again, this time holding two glasses of sparkling water. "I thought mysterious. People were supposed to stay mysterious," she said. "I tried. It lasted about 15 minutes. She accepted one of the glasses. "That bad?" "Worse." His expression made her laugh. "You know, for someone so popular, you complain a lot. That is because popularity and enjoyment are not the same thing." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "That might be the smartest thing I have heard all night." They moved toward a quieter corner near a display of fresh white orchids. For the first time since arriving, Elena felt completely at ease. Graham surprised her. Most successful people she had met wanted to talk about achievements. He seemed interested in everything except his own. "So tell me about the drawings," he said. "There is not much to tell." "I doubt that." She glanced down at her sketchbook. "I started drawing when I was 10. My mother worked at the public library. Whenever she had extra shifts, I sat in the art section and copied illustrations from books. And now I do freelance projects. Book covers, small commissions, local businesses. Do you enjoy it?" Elena smiled softly. More than anything. Graham noticed how her entire face changed when she talked about art. The nervousness disappeared. The self-doubt faded. For the first time all evening, she looked completely confident. "Then why do you say it is just a hobby?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. "Because it does not exactly pay Manhattan rent." "That was not my question." Elena looked at him for a moment before laughing quietly. "You ask dangerous questions. Occupational hazard. And what exactly is your occupation?" Graham hesitated. "Business." "That is wonderfully vague." "I have been told that before." "Several times." "Many." They both laughed. The conversation drifted naturally from art to books, from books to travel, from travel to childhood memories. Hours seemed to disappear. Elena told him about spending summers in upstate New York with her grandparents. Graham shared stories about fishing trips with his father when he was young. Neither mentioned money. Neither mentioned status. It was the easiest conversation either of them had experienced in a very long time. As Elena turned a page in her sketchbook, the handmade bookmark slipped free and floated to the floor. Neither noticed immediately. They continued talking as another announcement echoed through the ballroom, calling guests toward the main stage. Eventually, Elena closed her sketchbook. "I should probably head home soon." "Already?" The question escaped Graham before he could stop it. Elena smiled. "It is getting late." "I suppose it is." Together, they began walking toward the ballroom entrance. Neither realized that the bookmark decorated with tiny watercolor wildflowers still rested beneath a nearby chair. And as they disappeared into the crowd moving toward the stage, someone else noticed it lying there alone. As guests gradually gathered near the main stage, the atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted. Conversations softened. Crystal glasses were set aside. Anticipation moved through the room like an invisible current. Elena followed the crowd, careful to stay near the back, where she felt most comfortable. The evening had already been far more memorable than she expected. She had met a stranger who somehow made her feel seen in a room filled with people who barely noticed she existed. That alone felt unusual enough. What she did not notice was a pair of watchful eyes following her from across the ballroom. The woman who had interrupted Graham earlier stood beside two friends, her expression cool and calculating. Her name was Victoria Langley, and she was accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted. Throughout the evening, she had watched Graham spend more time with Elena than with anyone else. The realization irritated her more than she cared to admit. "Who is she?" one of her friends asked quietly. Victoria glanced toward Elena. "I have no idea. She does not look familiar." "Because she is not." The women exchanged curious looks. In their world, everyone important knew everyone important. Elena clearly did not belong to any circle they recognized. Victoria signaled to one of the event coordinators she knew personally. A brief conversation followed. 30 seconds later, the answer arrived. Victoria's lips curved into a faint smile. Interesting. What? Her friend asked. She is not a guest. What do you mean? She was working registration. The three women looked toward Elena again. Suddenly, everything made sense to them. The simple dress. The nervous body language. The fact that nobody seemed to know her name. Victoria shook her head. Unbelievable. Meanwhile, Elena remained completely unaware of the conversation. She stood near a decorative floral arrangement, watching technicians make final preparations for the evening's awards presentation. She checked her phone. Nearly 10:30. She should leave soon. Her subway ride back to Brooklyn would take almost an hour. Just as she slipped the phone back into her purse, a familiar voice called out nearby. There she is. Elena turned. Victoria approached with two other women beside her. All three wore polished smiles that somehow felt colder than genuine expressions. Hi, Elena said politely. Hello, Victoria replied. I do not believe we have met. I do not think we have. Victoria Langley. Elena Hartwell. Lovely to meet you. The words sounded pleasant enough, but something about the exchange immediately made Elena uncomfortable. How have you been enjoying the gala? Victoria asked. It has been wonderful. Really? Victoria tilted her head slightly. That surprises me. Elena blinked. Why? Well, events like this are usually intended for invited guests. The sentence landed softly, but the meaning behind it felt sharp. Elena felt heat creep into her cheeks. I was helping cover a shift. Yes, I heard. One of the other women smiled. That explains a lot. Elena suddenly understood. They knew. There is nothing wrong with honest work, she said quietly. Of course not, Victoria replied. But sometimes people confuse access with belonging. The nearby conversation around them seemed to fade. Elena could feel several guests beginning to notice the exchange. I never claimed to belong here, she said. That is refreshing. Victoria's smile widened. Because some people might misunderstand your presence, especially if they saw you spending time with certain individuals. Elena immediately knew who she meant. Her stomach tightened. We were just talking. I am sure. The women exchanged amused glances. Still, misunderstandings happen. For a moment, Elena simply stood there. She was not angry. She was embarrassed. Deeply embarrassed. Not because of her job. Not because of who she was. But because she suddenly realized how the evening must look through their eyes. A temporary worker chatting with a wealthy stranger. A girl from Brooklyn standing in a room she could never afford to enter on her own. The old insecurities she spent years fighting began creeping back. Maybe they were right. Maybe she never should have stayed after her shift ended. Maybe she had mistaken kindness for something more meaningful. Elena lowered her gaze. Excuse me, she said softly. Then she turned and started walking toward the exit, unaware that across the ballroom, Graham had just seen everything. Elena moved quickly through the crowd, keeping her eyes on the ballroom entrance. The excitement she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a familiar ache she thought she had left behind years ago. She hated feeling out of place. She hated being reminded that some people could look at a job title, a bank account, or a zip code and decide exactly how much respect a person deserved. Around her, conversations continued as though nothing had happened. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Glasses clinked. The evening carried on. But for Elena, the magic had disappeared. She tightened her grip on her purse and headed toward the exit. Across the room, Graham watched her leave. He had not heard every word Victoria said, but he had seen enough. He had seen Elena's smile vanish. He had seen the embarrassment in her eyes. Most importantly, he had seen her decide to walk away. A feeling of frustration settled in his chest. It was not anger. It was disappointment. The kind that came when people revealed exactly who they were. Mr. Whitmore, a board member beside him asked. The program is about to begin. Graham barely heard him. His attention remained fixed on Elena as she moved closer to the doors. For a second, he considered letting it go. The easy option would be to remain where he was. To smile for photographs. To give his speech. To do exactly what everyone expected. Instead, he set down his glass. Excuse me, he said. Then he started walking. Several people called his name. Others tried stopping him for conversations. Graham ignored them all. He crossed the ballroom with a purpose that immediately attracted attention. Guests began turning their heads. The movement created a ripple through the crowd. People noticed because men like Graham Whitmore rarely abandoned important conversations. They certainly did not leave groups of influential investors standing mid-sentence. Yet that was exactly what he was doing. Elena had nearly reached the entrance when she heard someone call her name. She froze. Slowly she turned around. Graham was standing there. For a moment she simply stared. "You are leaving." It was not a question. "I think it is time." Because of what happened, Elena forced a small smile. "It is not a big deal. You are a terrible liar." Despite herself, she laughed softly. "That is rude." "It is accurate." The tension eased slightly. Around them, curious eyes watched from every direction. Elena became painfully aware of the attention. "You really should not be over here," she said quietly. "Why not?" "Because everyone is staring." Graham glanced around the ballroom. "Let them." Elena blinked. The simple confidence of the response caught her off guard. "You make that sound easy." "It becomes easier when you stop letting strangers decide who you are." For a second neither spoke. Then Graham continued. "You know what I saw tonight?" "What?" "I saw someone who spent hours helping people without asking for recognition. Someone who made an entire room feel less intimidating simply by being herself." Elena looked away. "I think you are giving me too much credit." "I do not." His voice remained calm but steady. "And for the record, there is not a single person in this ballroom whose opinion matters more to me than character." The words settled between them. Genuine. Unforced. Real. Elena felt some of the embarrassment begin to fade. Not because he had defended her. Because he seemed to understand exactly what she was feeling. Before she could respond, the lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly. "Hey!" Voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please take your seats. Our awards presentation is about to begin." Guests immediately began moving toward their tables. The evening's main event had arrived. Graham glanced toward the stage, then back at Elena. "Do not leave yet." "Why?" He smiled. "Trust me." Elena hesitated. She had known him only a few hours. She still did not know what he actually did for a living. Yet something about the way he said it made her stay. Together they turned toward the stage as spotlights illuminated the center of the ballroom. Neither of them noticed that, near the front row, an event staff member had just found a small handmade bookmark decorated with watercolor wildflowers and carefully placed it beside the reserved seat waiting for Graham Whitmore. Elena followed Graham toward the seating area, still unsure why she had agreed to stay. The ballroom lights dimmed further until only the stage remained brightly illuminated. Hundreds of guests settled into their seats. Conversations faded into silence. Elena chose a chair near the back of the room, hoping to disappear into the crowd once again. Graham, however, was guided toward a reserved table near the front. Before taking his seat, he glanced over his shoulder and offered her a small, reassuring smile. It was a simple gesture, yet somehow it eased the nervousness twisting inside her stomach. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the annual charity gala. Applause filled the room. Awards were presented. Names were announced. Business leaders walked on stage and delivered carefully prepared speeches. Elena listened politely, but her attention drifted. Her mind kept replaying the evening, the registration desk, the conversation by the window, the embarrassment she had felt only minutes earlier. Most of all, she kept thinking about Graham. There was still something she could not quite figure out about him. Then the host returned to the microphone with a smile. "And now," he announced, "we come to our final award of the evening. This recognition is reserved for an individual whose leadership, philanthropy, and vision have transformed countless lives across the country." A large screen behind the stage lit up. Images began appearing one after another. Office buildings, community centers, scholarship programs, hospitals. Elena watched with mild curiosity. Over the past decade, the host continued, this person has built one of the most influential investment firms in America while donating hundreds of millions of dollars to education, healthcare, and local communities. A murmur of admiration swept through the ballroom. Elena sat up straighter. The screen shifted to a photograph of a man standing beside a group of students. Her breath caught instantly. No, it could not be. The next image appeared. Then another. Each one showed the same face. The same calm blue eyes. The same easy smile. Graham. Elena stared at the screen in complete disbelief. The host's voice echoed through the room. Please join me in congratulating this year's recipient of the Humanitarian Leadership Award. Mr. Graham Whitmore. The ballroom erupted into applause. People rose from their seats. Cameras flashed. Elena felt frozen. Every conversation they had shared replayed in her mind. Business. That was how he had described his occupation. Business. Her heart raced as Graham calmly stood from his chair and walked toward the stage. The audience greeted him like royalty. Investors, politicians, celebrities, executives. Everyone seemed to know exactly who he was. Everyone except her. Graham accepted the award and approached the microphone. The applause gradually faded. "Thank you," he began. "I am honored by this recognition, but I have always believed that leadership is not measured by wealth, titles, or influence. It is measured by how we treat people when there is nothing to gain in return." Elena lowered her eyes. Somehow those words felt directed at something much bigger than the award itself. Graham continued. "The most meaningful moments in life often come from unexpected encounters. Sometimes a person can remind you what matters simply by being genuine." His gaze briefly swept across the audience. For a fraction of a second, it landed on Elena. She immediately looked away. The realization hit her all at once. He was not just successful. He was one of the most powerful people in the room. Maybe the most powerful. Suddenly the distance between their worlds felt enormous. When the speech ended, the audience stood once again. Applause thundered through the ballroom. Graham thanked the crowd and stepped away from the microphone. Instantly, several elegant women began positioning themselves near the front of the stage, including Victoria and her friends. They were waiting, smiling, confident, certain that Graham would come directly toward them. Elena watched from the back, feeling more out of place than ever. Quietly, she reached for her purse. Maybe now was the right time to leave. But before she could stand, Graham stepped off the stage, ignored every person waiting for his attention, and began walking through the crowd. Not toward the front tables, not toward the investors, not toward Victoria, straight toward the back of the ballroom, where Elena Hartwell sat in stunned silence. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath as Graham continued walking through the crowd. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Photographers lowered their cameras, then quickly raised them again. Even the event staff paused to watch. Elena remained frozen in her seat. Part of her still hoped she had misunderstood what was happening. Maybe he was heading toward someone behind her. Maybe another important guest was seated nearby. But with every step he took, that possibility disappeared. Graham stopped directly in front of her. For a moment, neither spoke. The contrast between the room's attention and the quiet expression in his eyes felt almost surreal. "You were leaving," he said softly. Elena swallowed. "I thought that might be best." "I disagree." A few nervous laughs escaped her. "You seem to have that effect on people. Only when they are wrong." The warmth in his voice eased some of her tension, but not all of it. She glanced around the ballroom. Hundreds of eyes were watching. Victoria stood near the stage, visibly stunned. The other women who had spent the evening trying to capture Graham's attention looked equally confused. None of them understood what was happening. Truthfully, neither did Elena. "You should probably be talking to people who matter," she said quietly. Graham looked genuinely puzzled. "I am." The answer came so naturally that Elena could not immediately respond. The room grew even quieter. Then a journalist near the front called out a question. "Mr. Whitmore, can we ask who the young woman is?" Several reporters immediately followed with questions of their own. Cameras turned toward Elena. She instinctively wanted to disappear. Graham noticed. Without hesitation, he stepped slightly closer, creating a sense of protection without making a scene. "Her name is Elena Hartwell," he said, "and she is someone I am very glad I met tonight." The response only increased the curiosity in the room. Another reporter spoke up. "You have spent most of the evening with her. Many people are wondering why." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the ballroom. Everyone knew exactly what the question meant. Why her? Why the quiet girl from nowhere instead of the accomplished women surrounding him all night? Why someone nobody recognized? Graham remained calm. He looked at Elena for a brief second before turning back toward the crowd. "Because she is the only person I have spoken to tonight who wanted nothing from me." Silence followed. Complete silence. "She did not know my title," Graham continued. "She did not ask about my company. She did not care how much money I have. We talked about books, art, family, real things." His voice never rose, yet every word carried through the ballroom. In a room filled with people trying to impress each other, she was simply herself. Elena felt emotion tighten in her chest. Nobody had ever described her that way before. Graham smiled slightly. That is rarer than people think. Across the room, several guests lowered their eyes. Others nodded thoughtfully. Even some of the reporters seemed caught off guard by the sincerity of his answer. Victoria stood motionless near the stage. For the first time all evening, she appeared uncertain. Elena remembered every word that had been said to her earlier. You do not belong here. Some people confuse access with belonging. Yet standing there now, she realized something important. Graham was not defending her because of pity. He was defending the values she represented. The values money could not buy. One of the event organizers suddenly approached Graham carrying a small item. Sir, he said, we found this near your table. Graham accepted it and immediately recognized the watercolor bookmark. Elena's bookmark. The tiny painted wildflowers looked almost fragile beneath the ballroom lights. I have been looking for that, Elena said with surprise. Graham studied it carefully before handing it back to her. You made this? Years ago. It is beautiful. Elena smiled as she accepted it. Somehow the bookmark felt different now, more meaningful, like a reminder of the person she was before self-doubt tried convincing her otherwise. Graham glanced at the clock near the stage. The gala was ending. Guests were beginning to stand and gather their belongings. But before the evening could fade into memory, he made a decision. Elena, he said, his voice calm but serious. Would you let me take you to dinner sometime this week? The question landed like a spark in a room already filled with surprise. And for the first time all night, Elena found herself smiling without hesitation. 3 days later, Elena still could not believe any of it had actually happened. More than once she wondered whether the entire evening had been some elaborate dream created by an exhausted imagination. Yet every time she looked at her phone, she saw the message Graham had sent the morning after the gala. Simple, polite, genuine, just like him. Their first dinner took place at a quiet restaurant overlooking the Hudson River. To Elena's surprise, there were no photographers, no headlines, no crowd of important people waiting for Graham's attention. It was just the two of them sitting by a window as boats drifted across dark water illuminated by city lights. The conversation felt as effortless as it had during the gala. Hours passed without either of them noticing. Then dinner turned into coffee. Coffee turned into walks through Central Park. Walks turned into long phone calls that sometimes lasted until midnight. For the first time in years, Graham found himself looking forward to something that had nothing to do with business. Meanwhile, Elena slowly stopped seeing him as a billionaire and started seeing him simply as Graham. Kind, curious, thoughtful. Several weeks later, Graham stood inside a small community center in Brooklyn, completely confused. You are sure this is the right address? He asked his assistant over the phone. Positive, she replied. Miss Hartwell volunteers there every Saturday. Graham ended the call and looked around. The building was modest. The paint on the walls showed signs of age. Folding tables filled the main room. Art supplies covered nearly every available surface. Crayons, colored pencils, watercolor sets, sketch pads. Then he heard laughter. He followed the sound and stopped at the doorway. Elena sat at a long table surrounded by children and teenagers from the neighborhood. Some were drawing landscapes. Others worked on comic books. A few proudly displayed paintings still drying on paper racks. Elena moved between them with patient encouragement. That shadow looks fantastic. Try adding a little more blue here. You should be proud of that. Graham watched silently. None of the students seemed to know who she was outside this room. To them, she was simply Miss Elena. The person who showed up every week. The person who remembered birthdays. The person who believed in their talent before they believed in themselves. You never mentioned any of this, Graham said later as they walked outside. Elena looked confused. Mention what? The classes. She shrugged. It is not a big deal. Graham laughed softly. You keep saying that about extraordinary things. They are free art lessons. For almost 60 kids. Elena looked away. When I was younger, art gave me confidence. I wanted someone else to have that opportunity too. Graham felt something shift inside him. Throughout his life, he had met philanthropists who donated money for publicity. Investors who sponsored programs because it improved their image. Elena spent every Saturday here without cameras, recognition, or rewards. She did it because she genuinely cared. That realization stayed with him. A month later, Graham invited Elena to attend the opening of a new community arts initiative funded by his foundation. Over the next several months, the initiative continued to grow far beyond anyone's expectations. More children enrolled. Additional community partners joined the project. New funding expanded the program across multiple neighborhoods. Elena expected a simple ceremony. Instead, she walked into a renovated warehouse transformed into a beautiful public gallery. Sunlight poured through tall windows. Paintings covered the walls. Sculptures filled the center space. Hundreds of guests moved through the building. "This is incredible," she whispered. Graham smiled but said nothing. Then she noticed something strange. One entire section of the gallery featured artwork created by children from her Saturday classes. Every drawing had been professionally framed. Every young artist's name appeared beneath their work. Elena stared in disbelief. "How did you?" "I asked the community center director for help," Graham admitted. "The kids deserve to be seen." Emotion filled her eyes. "You did all this?" "Actually," Graham said quietly, "you did. I just gave them walls." For several seconds Elena could not speak. Looking around the gallery, she realized something extraordinary had happened. The kindness she quietly shared every week had grown into something far larger than she ever imagined. And standing beside her, Graham knew with complete certainty that he had never admired anyone more. 6 months later, the Community Arts Center had become one of the most successful local programs in New York. What started as a small weekend class now served hundreds of students across several neighborhoods. New classrooms had opened. Scholarships had been created. Young artists who once doubted themselves now displayed their work with pride. Yet despite all the growth, Elena remained exactly the same. She still arrived early every Saturday morning, carrying coffee in one hand and art supplies in the other. She still remembered every student's name. She still believed that kindness mattered more than recognition. Graham loved that about her. In a world where so many people changed the moment success arrived, Elena stayed grounded. One crisp autumn evening, Graham invited her to attend a special exhibition at the gallery. "Another surprise?" Elena asked as they entered the building. "Maybe," he replied with a smile. The gallery looked different than usual. Soft golden lights illuminated the walls. Fresh flowers decorated the space. Family, friends, community leaders, and many of Elena's students filled the room. Laughter echoed through the building. Elena looked around in confusion. "What is all this?" "A celebration," Graham answered, "for everything you helped build." As guests mingled throughout the gallery, Elena noticed a new display near the center of the room. Unlike the other exhibits, this one stood alone beneath a spotlight. Curious, she slowly walked toward it. The moment she saw what was inside the glass case, she stopped. Her breath caught. It was her bookmark. The same handmade bookmark decorated with watercolor wildflowers. The one she had carried for years. The one she had nearly lost on the night they met. But now it rested inside a beautiful frame. Beneath it sat a small engraved plaque. Elena stepped closer and read the words aloud. "The moment I found what money could never buy." Tears immediately filled her eyes. She turned toward Graham. For a moment neither spoke. The room seemed to fade away. The noise disappeared. The crowd vanished. There was only the two of them standing together in the place where so much had changed. Graham took a slow breath. "That night at the gala, everyone expected me to notice power, status, and influence." His voice remained calm but emotional. "Instead, I met someone who reminded me why those things are never enough." Elena felt tears slipping down her cheeks. Graham continued, "You never tried to impress me. You never wanted anything from me. You simply showed me who you were." Several guests nearby quietly watched. Some smiled. Others wiped away tears of their own. "You taught me that success means very little if you have nobody genuine to share it with." Graham reached into his jacket pocket. The room grew silent. Elena's heart began racing. "And every day since then, you have given me another reason to be grateful that you stayed when you almost walked away." Slowly, Graham lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps spread throughout the gallery. Elena covered her mouth in shock. Graham looked up at her with the same kindness she had seen on the night he helped her pick up scattered name badges from a marble floor. "Elena Hartwell," he said softly, "will you spend the rest of your life with me?" Tears streamed freely now. Elena laughed through them, unable to stop smiling. For several seconds, she could not speak. Then she nodded. "Yes." The single word filled the room with joy. Applause erupted instantly. Friends cheered. Students celebrated. Graham stood and slipped the ring onto her finger. The moment felt perfect not because of the gallery, the success, or the attention. It felt perfect because it was real. 1 year later, they stood together beneath a clear spring sky surrounded by family, close friends, and members of the community they loved. The ceremony was simple, warm, personal, exactly what they wanted. As Elena looked around, she noticed many familiar faces. Former students, volunteers, neighbors, people whose lives had touched theirs and been touched in return. Graham gently squeezed her hand. She smiled back. Neither of them could have predicted what would happen on the night they first met. A billionaire had entered a gala expecting another routine evening. A shy artist had arrived believing she did not belong. Yet the most important moments in life rarely announce themselves in advance. Sometimes they begin with a simple act of kindness. Sometimes they begin with a conversation beside a window. And sometimes they begin when one person sees value in another long before the rest of the world does. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to The Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.